Yes, thank you very much, and I appreciate Professor Fallon's comments, and I'm sorry that he isn't here for the back and forth. I do want to make one sort of quick point of clarification on them. My position is not that the rules of change that we have today had to have been in place themselves at the founding. You could have a situation where there was rule of change 1 at the founding, and then using rule of change 1, sometime in the 1880s, they introduced rule of change 2, and now that's what we've got. That's okay, so long as the way you got it is ultimately traceable back to the founding. It's not that there was a single list of rules of change, and we've kept them all the way since. But taking that on, the real question that I think there are sort of 2 points that Professor Fallon identifies. One is that sort of what kind of continuity are we really talking about here, and do we really accept? So everyone accepts the idea that the Constitution is still our law. But there's not a whole lot you can really do from that, because when they say that, people often mean very different things. They might say, you know, the Constitution is the same one we had at the founding, but we just interpret it differently now, so it does different stuff, like having the same river. I think that continuity, for my purposes, I'm using continuity as a sort of a stipulated term with stipulated definition, namely one of legal continuity, the idea of the same legal rules, or sort of modified only in the way that the legal rules allow themselves to be modified. That is a much more stringent definition of continuity than of this general sense that it's sort of the same legal system. And H.L.A. Hart, for instance, talks about, you know, what are the identity criteria for having the same legal system. He says they're much more flexible than having the same laws. So it may well be that there are lots of intermediate degrees of continuity. Why should one you know, have mine as opposed to anything else? So I think 2 points on that. The first is to recognize the very important way in which legal continuity, in my sense, is a requirement of legal systems generally, though we do not necessarily require continuity back to a specific and recognized founding. So try and imagine what the law would look like if we didn't have the rule that the law stays the same until it's properly changed. It would mean that sort of our statements about the law could change at any given time without necessarily there having to have been any legal rule permitting that. The best example I can come up with something like this is Calvin Ball, where the rules change sort of virtually without notice, and there is no way of specifying in advance what changes are and are not valid. Now, I should make clear, I'm not saying that the law sort of mechanically, sort of the world has to conform to this particular view of the law. Obviously, legal changes occur all the time. The American Revolution was illegal under British law. And, you know, I recognize that. And lots of stuff happens every day. Congress passes unconstitutional statutes. People commit crimes, et cetera. The question is whether we, thinking within the terms of a legal system, say, OK, that has changed the law. Or, no, that was illegal. We are required, if we want to stick with our current legal system, to view that as void. The example in the paper is if the president declared, I'm going to repeal all jaywalking laws. You know, he might say that. Whether we give it any legal effect or not is a separate question. And if we do give it legal effect, we can only do so by essentially picking a new set of laws that is different from the set of laws we had beforehand. So the real question is, why do we think we have the same set of laws that we do at the founding? In part, it is true that some of the answer to that question I outsource to this other paper. I'm sorry that Professor Fallon isn't here, and also sorry I had sent him the draft of that other paper a while ago, but he had written to me that he would be unable to review it in time, which I certainly understand. One paper is enough of mine. But I think that you know, the best account for why that might be the case is that we don't just view ourselves as having the same Constitution, whatever that might mean. We view the Constitution as having certain content over time, as being in some sense the inheritors of the founders' laws, and not just of a text to which other meanings might plausibly be assigned. And that's a contentious argument, and people might disagree with it. But I think that in general, if one looks at the sort of official story that we tell ourselves in various occasions throughout American history, it has that form. And moreover, I think there are good reasons why we care about the official story. Well, in some ways, a change to our official story about the laws we have is a change to our law, and not just you know, a judgment that we might revise based on our other commitments in reflective equilibrium. But I'm sure we'll talk about that more. Finally, I just want to respond quickly to Professor Alexander's 2 points. First, I'm not sure I'd agree with the framing of who are the authorities whose positive norms are law, only to the extent that sometimes it might not really be authorities, in the sense that common law might have roots in custom that aren't sort of plausibly described as individual people generating symbols. And the second thing is, I don't think that my paper is committed to the view that it has always been thus. So I think I give the example in the paper, I apologize if it's dropped out, of the Restoration in England and Charles II. It's possible to decide in 1660 that henceforth we shall act as if the laws pre-English Civil War have always been our law, even though we know that that's not the case. We're not claiming historically that there was no Cromwell. We know that it all happened. We're just saying that we're going to act as if it didn't happen for certain legal purposes and not others. And so it would be okay, under my view, if we haven't always been that way. It's just that right now, the way we understand our law is as requiring this sort of chain of title back to some earlier date.
Okay. We have 14 people now on the queue. So I'll just read this so you can figure out where you stand here. Will Bode, Judd Campbell, and Mitch Berman in the first group. Chris Green, Larry Solom, Randy Barnett. In the second group, John Ollendorf, Mike Ramsey, David Oven in the third group. Sam Rickles, Ilya Soman, Yvonne Yu in the fourth group. And then John Harrison and Chris Yu as the caboose here. Will.
Thank you. So, Steve, I love this paper, and I agree with almost all of it. I think that Fallon's point may be right, that it's an ambitious paper and it's trying to do two things, and it may be hard to do them at the same time. One is to explain what the positivist theory of originalism is. I take it that's the continuity thesis, is to say that this is sort of, if we could show this to be true, originalism would follow, and this is a useful definition of originalism. And then the second thing which you say is that also it's plausible that this does in fact describe our current social practices or our current rule of recognition. And it takes a lot of work to understand one, and then I think you encounter people who are skeptical at two, and so I think that's right. I guess I'm interested in two, because I'm totally sold on one. And I'd like to know just sort of your thoughts on what exactly we'd look for to figure out whether you're right or wrong. What's the falsifiability question? So the first question is about official stories. You say, which I tend to agree with, that the key thing is that everybody talks about continuity at the founding. Justice Breyer's book claims that active liberty is a way of thinking about the Constitution that you could derive back then. And the same thing is true of Larry Kramer. A lot of people find their non-originalism from the founding, and that's important. And I guess I wonder, what do we do if if we have reason to believe that nobody really believes their official stories? That when Justice Kagan gets up and says we're all originalists now, she doesn't mean it. That if you asked Justice Breyer about the first chapter of Active Liberty, he wouldn't remember what he said, and he'd even be kind of embarrassed. If it turned out that the story really is just a story, as it was put to me recently, Roman priests reading entrails and pretending to discover the will of the gods, when everybody knows that's not how it really works. Whether that's a problem or whether the story is good enough. Related to that, sort of whose story or who has to believe it. If it turns out that the elites are telling one story and the man on the street is telling a different story, whose story matters, I'm not sure which one's going to help you, because you might say the man on the street really believes in originalism. The man on the street may not have any, or the woman on the street, or anybody on the street may not have views about it at all. And then that gets to the sort of the summing up question, which is, if you were going to design a well-funded survey to figure out whether or not this is true or false, what would it look like? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So I like the paper as well. My question is, by law, do you mean only that which is enforceable in court? And if so, does that fix judicial deference standards in place? And if not, do you have to do something else to figure out what the methods of interpretation are outside of court?
Mitch? I like this project, Stephen. And I appreciate the plug to my work with Kevin. So I'm going to try to press on you what I was trying to press on you before in our email exchange. Okay? Let's suppose that a certain originalist view is right. I share your view that originalism is most perspicuously understood actually as ultimately a claim about law. That makes best sense of the debate between originalists and non-originalists, for example. So let's suppose that it is true that some communicative content of the constitutional text constitutes the law. I think that's a fairly common originalist view. Now, if that's true, or something broadly like it, if it's true, in virtue of what is it true? What makes it true that the content of our supreme law is determined by the communicative content of the constitutional text? Well, what would make it true, I think, is that there is an ultimate or basic or fundamental legal principle that says that. And you don't think that that legal principle is true in the nature of things. You think that if there is such a legal principle in our system, in a particular legal system, it's a truth about that legal system. More generally, there are just ultimate legal principles in any legal system. You speak of basic legal principle. You use the phrase a basic legal principle, basically one of non-desuetude, right, with respect to statutes. Okay. So if these are the fundamental legal principles, whatever they are, what makes them the case? What makes them true? It's not in virtue of something legal, right? That would be circular. What makes them true is that they're the fundamental legal principles of our system. And what explains them, or what makes them the case, has to be explained by non-legal facts, like social practices. Somehow these ultimate legal principles are going to supervene on some sorts of social facts. So I worry that your claim about the continuity thesis commits you to a view about fundamental principles in law which just is mistaken. So they can't change, the fundamental legal principles can't change only because legal rules license it. They're prior to other legal rules. They change in virtue of non-legal things, like social practices. So on that vision of law, it would seem to be sort of a non-starter to propose that the ultimate legal principles of any legal system, whatever they might be, and I could stipulate for these purposes that your continuity thesis is true, a true ultimate legal principle of our system at this moment. I could also grant for stipulation that it is a true legal principle of our system that the law is just the communicative content of the text, something like this. Whatever it is, it comes about because of non-legal change. And therefore, I find paradoxical the idea that these ultimate legal principles cannot themselves change except if licensed by legal principles. That's my worry here.
So let me take Mitch's point first. So I absolutely agree with your claim in the sense that ultimate legal principles supervene on social facts, so they can't change unless the social facts change. And so it would be very odd to think that that means that their changes are limited by legal rules, because legal rules can't possibly determine what the social facts will be. They don't have that kind of power to reach out and grab history and make it be different. My point is that, suppose that American social facts today produce some fundamental legal principles. I don't even claim to know what they are. You know, fundamental legal principle X has, as a consequence, this rule about continuity, that what counts as the law today depends in certain ways on what counted as the law in 1788. That could be true as a statement of law today. And so that statement is an evaluative statement about legal changes. What it means to say about, to say that our law today has only these particular rules of legal change is to make a claim about, if the president said that he could repeal all jaywalking laws, he'd be wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that the president wouldn't actually, in fact, get away with it. If in fact, the president did get away with it, we would say that, look, the social facts have changed. People no longer accept whatever social facts give rise to fundamental legal principles, something is different now. And now it's wrong to say that our law goes back all the way to 1788 because look at this new discordant thing, namely the president's ability to repeal jaywalking laws. Continuity has been broken, at least continuity that far back. So I'm not saying that continuity is true of fundamental legal principles. I'm saying that whatever our fundamental legal principles are, they entail that continuity is true as a statement about our current legal requirements. And that might change. We might decide, that might have already changed. Maybe continuity turns out to be false based on current social facts. But that's the separate question. Now that takes us to Will's question, which is what is it about these social facts that make continuity true? Or make something else true that then entails continuity and so forth. Part of the problem here is that I have not yet solved jurisprudence. So if I had, I could then give you an answer as to whose story and sort of why do we have to believe it? You know, is it elites? Is it common people? Is it something else? Is it officials and judges? I mean, like, you know, who's social facts about who get to determine the law? The reason and so that's why I can't possibly answer the survey question. The reason, though, that I think it's plausible still to make claims is that even though one might be a positivist and yet be able to make claims like, you know, the Internal Revenue Code is the law without knowing the answers to all these things. So there's at least some degree of overlapping consensus that allows us to say, like, we're not totally sure exactly if we bear it down, but you know what, there's enough agreement that we can. Now, maybe it's the case, and Matt Adler has taken this position, that we in fact lack a real constitutional law in America because we do not have sufficient agreement in the way that we need to generate conclusions about the Constitution. There's just too much disagreement socially and otherwise for us to generate any actual legal rules. I'm not sure it's quite that bad. I think the fact that the official stories do seem relatively consistent with each other and with this requirement of continuity is very salient and allows us to ground claims. The question, though, about like what if those official stories are smokescreens? And you sort of raised something on this with your point about the Illuminati. So what if we discovered that, in fact, all the judges in America are members of the Illuminati? You know, they act like they're deciding things in accordance with the US Code, but really this is all some giant Illuminati conspiracy in accordance with the Rand Corporation and the lizard people. If that were true, I still think it would be plausible to say, as you suggested in that post, that we have law in the United States, that the US Code is part of it, and that the judges are in some ways systematically violating that law by doing their Illuminati thing. I think that that's a plausible jurisprudential theory. Justifying that might require sort of more jurisprudence than I'm ready to serve up right now. But I think that we can agree. I think that that's plausible enough that we can agree on it. Say, look, if the official stories are smokescreens, well, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. Finally, on Judd's point, so very quickly, I do not think that law is only what's enforceable in court. Law is, in some sense, you know, all the things that we think law is, that we think, you know, having a very broad positivist meaning. And I think that lots of things are law, even if they're not enforceable in court, and would be incorporated in my story.
Okay, it's Chris Green, Larry Solom, and Randy Barnett.
Okay, really minor point. Lots of interesting stuff I don't know what to say about, but I mean, is this really what the originalism debate is about? So continuity just seems too thin. If David Strauss could conceivably be an originalist, I mean, that's just a reductio ad absurdum of this as a definition of the term originalism. So it seems like discontinuity isn't, I mean, it's an important thing to talk about, but I mean, really, so imagine a kind of discontinuous function. You know, lots and lots of continuous functions from here back to the founding. I mean, really what originalism is about something that's not just continuous, but constant. So, I mean, you got to have a thicker thing if it's really going to be an original, you know, a theory of original something. It's got to stay the same, not just, you know, have changed continuously.
So 3 suggestions. The first is about the thing you say you're not yet prepared to do. And I just do not think you can write this paper without more, a thicker account of the underlying theory of legal validity, right? Or in other words, you have to confront the rule of recognition stuff. Because if you don't, right, if you leave it loosey-goosey, then there is a very plausible living constitutionalist story that the current rule of recognition, right, accepts departures from the original meaning of the Constitution, however it's defined. And your, your official statements are important argument is not enough without a theory underneath it that makes the official statements important. Second suggestion is that you modify the statement of the continuity thesis on page 29, right? So this is your official version of the thesis, and it's got a 1, the rules in 1788 are valid, 2, changes are valid if the change is authorized by those rules or by a rule that itself was valid under the change. But it's 3 that is problematic. No rules are valid except by operation of 1 and 2, right? So that statement will run into problems if either there is underdeterminacy of the rules for validity in 1788 or at any point thereafter. And I would just submit that it's highly implausible that the rules were completely determinate then and that they have remained completely determinate after then. Or, that's the underdeterminacy part, or you run into problems if it is the case, a la Adler and many others, that there was no single rule of recognition or continues to be no single rule of recognition. That is, there are a plurality of beliefs about what rules are valid. They overlap to an extent that we have a working system, right? But at any given time, there can be legal changes that are valid according to some versions and invalid according to others. And this is, Dworkin has a spin on this point, his point about theoretical disagreement. Third suggestion is that you not characterize your position that originalism is a theory of legal content and not a theory of communicative content, because if you take that position, right, that a theory of communicative content is no part of originalism, then you are vulnerable to the objection that consistency with the Constitution and the rules of legal change that it provides itself can be updated, right, through non-legal processes, and therefore that meaning can change any which way and still comply with the continuity thesis.
Randy.
Steve, my comment is based on the email that I sent you and the exchange that we had. I think there are 2 distinctions that you absolutely have to deal with somehow. How you deal with it's up to you, but you're not dealing with it now, and you need to deal with it. As you know, I'm very sympathetic with the proposition that the law remains the same until it's properly changed. So that I'm okay with. But I think you just have to deal with the distinction between the higher law and ordinary law, which really doesn't come in. And because how higher law gets changed may very well be different than how ordinary law gets changed. And if in fact there is a positive law difference in your sense between those 2 kinds of law, which, if you just start with, Federalist 78, you'll see it's there, then it would affect a lot of what you're doing, and it would then bring into play the second distinction that I know you tell me in your email you don't want to deal with, but I think you can't just avoid it, and that is the distinction between interpretation and construction.
That is, there may be, and this has to do with your treatment of original methods at the end. And I point you to page 66, where you have sort of the pieces of both things here. It's not exactly why you're saying these things, but you see them here. One is that you have, in the middle of this first paragraph, that nor is this the claim. You're saying nor is this the claim, but that the original legal methods were somehow baked into the communicative content of the Constitution's words. Those original methods that were baked in to the content of the Constitution's words may have a different status than original methods that were not baked into the Constitution's words. And it's that those original methods are the place in which I agree with the McGinnis and Rappaport thesis. To the extent an original method really is part of the communicative content of the words, then I think, yes, original methods is right. And then right up above that, you say, there may have been applicable rules of founding era law that govern the text's legal effect. That is almost an explicit recognition of how constitutional construction is defined by some of us. And those rules, and you also say are not baked, you also say that are not baked into the legal meaning of the text, so they are legal methods that have a different status, and they may be ordinary law. And therefore, they may change, and they may be changed to maybe bring them more in convergence to what is baked into the communicative content. So none of this makes any sense, I think, in your account, because you just don't recognize these distinctions. Now, once you've recognized the distinction, and I don't think you can wish them away by saying I'd rather not talk about it, because if, in fact, there are two different activities, one is ascertaining communicative content, and the other is putting that content into effect, if these are actually two different things we do, just saying nothing about the two different things doesn't make the two different things go away. So you have to recognize distinctions, then handle them however you want, but they've got to be handled somehow.
Okay, you've got three.
Okay, so first on Chris's point, sort of how can it be that David Strauss is an originalist? And is continuity, in the sense of a continuous function from there to here, good enough? I think David Strauss, or a version of David Strauss, could be an originalist. And the reason would be essentially what we might call the Jeff Powell critique, which is if he could show that that was the law as of 1788, then the response would be, if that was the law as of 1788, why shouldn't we follow it today if we're an originalist? Why be more Catholic than the Pope? If the document that they thought they were setting down had certain features, namely, it creates some law, sure, but that law is to evolve in a common law way. It's certainly possible, but it would be at least a little odd for us to say, no, it can't. We're going to take the stuff that they created and not use other aspects of their law. One could have a defense of that, but I don't think that's the way that most sort of pictures the official story of American law work. That we're merely isolating particular parts of it and not others. The second, so Larry Sullivan's point, sort of, can one write this paper without a thicker account of jurisprudence? Maybe the answer is no, but I still would say that, again, the fact that we're able to do so much law without sharing a thicker account of jurisprudence, even though in theory what we think is the law depends on our jurisprudence, means that there might be enough shared agreement in the world for us to make some very useful legal conclusions. We make legal conclusions every day in court without discussing whether we're Hardians or Dworkinians or anything like that. So my claim is just that at least some of the propositions in this paper might be accepted based on shared agreements, but maybe your claim is not, and that I think would depend on a claim-by-claim basis whether there are particular things that have to be that we need further agree on. On the question of underdeterminacy, I think I need to think more about that issue, because it strikes me that if a rule were indeterminate at the founding, it would require some account of how, so one answer is just, well, it's equally indeterminate today, because that's the same rule we got. Or it might be, well, we've got some other rules, like rules authorizing judges or officials or other decision makers to fill in indeterminacies in particular ways, and those rules go all the way back, and so therefore we're allowed to use them. I'm not sure I guess what I mean to say is I'm not sure whether I need to relax condition 3 on page 29 to deal with indeterminacy, because if there are any indeterminacies, maybe they're just preserved in that way. A question about plurality of beliefs in 1788. It's certainly possible, you know, as I say in the paper, it's certainly possible there was a very broad disagreement in 1788 and since. Lawyers then might have disagreed just like lawyers do now. The claim, though, that we can say, you know, X was the law in 1788 assumes some way of overcoming those disagreements. Now, maybe we can't. Maybe the best thing is just to say we cannot make claims of the form or particular claims of the form, X was the law of the United States in 1788, just because there was so much disagreement about X that nobody knows, or that, you know, there is no fact of the matter about that particular question. If that were true, that would be a problem, but it would be a problem that in some ways sort of everybody has, and we might have other doctrines for what to do in cases of uncertainty. So let's say we have something where, as of today, in 2014, is X the law? We're uncertain. What do we do about that if the case actually comes up? We might have other doctrines in our quiver to sort of help adjudicators answer those questions, and maybe that's how we end up handling them. Finally, the issue on communicative content. I'm not entirely sure that I need to include a theory of communicative content in that way. The reason being that suppose that the founders disagreed with the fixation thesis. Suppose that they didn't think that communicative content was fixed at the time, that it can be updated in weird ways that we think are really odd. I don't know what one would do about that. Certainly, you know, all one could say is sort of the founder, you know, the law of 1788 was wrong about this conceptual point, but it might have been wrong about lots of stuff. Our law today might be wrong about lots of stuff, and it's not clear to me that we would necessarily amend it in any particular way. Finally, on Randy's points of higher law and ordinary law and interpretation and construction, I'm willing to concede that different kinds of law might have different rules of change attached to them. In our, you know, certainly statutes can only be changed by Congress, and the Constitution can only be changed, you know, in various other ways. But I'm not sure whether that is a distinction that I need to sort of highlight as a separate part of the thesis. Because my claim is just whatever the rules of change are at a given time, and whatever their scope is, whatever they apply to, if one wants to stick with the same rules, if one wants to avoid violating the system, those are the rules of change we use for whatever their scope might be. So that's what continuity entails. And it's not clear to me that I actually need a separate theory for higher law.
You're talking about originalism, right? Originalism is a constitutional theory, right?
It could be a constitutional theory, or it could be a much broader theory. I mean, in statute law, for instance, we have the intuition that statutes don't change until Congress changes them. Even really, really old statutes that go back to 1789. And so in some ways, this is an originalism for all of the law at once. And I think that it's more plausible to think about originalism as a subset of a broader theory about law than of its own theory that's specific to the Constitution and doesn't necessarily have implications to other aspects of law. Finally, on the interpretation and construction distinction, I don't think that, my point isn't that the distinction doesn't exist or that it's illusory or that we should confuse one with the other. My point is just that in making the claim that I make on page 66, that you take the text and you feed it into the lawmaking machine and you get some outputs. That can be true without the process for doing that being part of the communicative content for the text. What we're interested in is what the text did to the law. And we might have lots of opinions on what its communicative content was, and its communicative content might be very important for what law it made. Obviously, when we're reading statutes, we don't think that their outputs are totally arbitrary as related to, you know, what the statute actually means. We read them and we say what they means, and the law that gets created by that statute is very heavily connected to its communicative content. It's just not necessarily solely connected to its communicative content. And so which box it falls in, whether communicative content or something else, is not quite as important for the output and for my theory as it might be for some others. I apologize if this was somewhat unclear, but I'd be happy to go over it in further detail.
Our next troika is John Ohlendorf, Mike Ramsey, and David Upham.
Yeah, so I just want to first say I think this is a brilliant paper. I've told you this before, but I think this is just one of the most exciting things going on in originalist theory right now. So I really love the paper. And my point really just follows directly on Randy's and your response to Randy. I want to push a little bit on your understanding of contribution of the communicative content to legal rules, and in particular on when contribution happens, right? So I think sort of to me, the traditional view is that a text gets enacted at T1, and then at T2, when we come to apply the text, that's when contribution happens, according to sort of whatever rules for contribution are in place at T2. Your view, I take it, is that contribution happens at T1 when the text is enacted according to that set of rules for contribution. And so I just want to sort of point one sort of difficulty with that view. And this is also a difficulty for McGinnis and Rappaport's theory of original methods. So I think you need to tell us something about what legal rules in existence at T1 count as rules that bear on contribution. So I take a statutory example, right? So imagine at T1, a statute gets enacted that makes some new activity a crime. So it's clear that you think, for example, the T1 rules dealing with implied repeal are part of the set of rules that determine contribution at T1. But I don't think you would want to claim that, say, rules of accomplice liability or rules of attempts in existence at T1 bear on the contribution at T1. If we change those rules between T1 and T2, we'd apply the T2 rules of accomplice liability. So I think you need some account of what the statute's domain is, right, at T1. So for the traditional view, it's an easy account. It's whatever rules at T1 are part of the communicative content. Rules that are bearing on terms of art and that kind of thing, or pragmatic enrichment. But I think you need sort of a richer account of how you determine where the domain is.
Mike? Yeah, well, I think this is a great paper, and I'm persuaded by most of it, but I want to press on one thing, which this may really sort of be just restating what Larry Solom asked, but I'm going to restate it in a more specific way. And that is about the question of that something remains the same until the law remains the same until it's validly changed. But what does it mean to say that something is validly changed? So let me take the example of executive branch practice acquiesced in Congress, which you talk about a little bit on around page 42 of the paper, but I confess I didn't quite follow what your conclusion was. So to make it even more concrete, let's suppose that the original understanding of the original meaning of the Constitution is that the president can't start wars. But then let's suppose the president engages in a practice of starting wars and nobody much calls him on it. And so now the question is, has the Constitution been validly changed? And it seems to me you could answer this in three ways. Number one, you could ask, what did the framers think about this? Did they think this was a valid change? We can ask, what do we currently think? That is, we as a society, what are the current social facts? Do we think this is a valid lead? I don't mean the people in the room, but I mean, you know. And then we can ask, what's best? That is, normatively, what's the right rule? But it seems to me that these are not really satisfactory alternatives for you, any of them. Because if the question is, what do the framers think? Well, I don't think you've explained why we care what the framers think. Because we haven't decided that that's what matters yet, and then you need an account of why that's what matters. If the question is, what do we as a social fact think? Well, I think that's pretty problematic because, first of all, you're making your claim contingent on something that's going on in the world right now that, first of all, I don't know what it is. I don't know what the answer is. So there might not be much left of originalism, depending on what people on the street think. And also, I think, as a number of people have said, it's likely that people disagree on this point. And so I'm not sure how you would even answer that question. And And then you might well ask, well, let's think about what's best, but now you're asking a normative question, which is what you say you want to get away from. So I guess I'm not sure how you answer that. To put my cards on the table, I think that it's going to come back to what we think, what is thought to be best, and so that's why I'm skeptical this paper actually gets us out of the normative defense of originalism that you say you want to get out of. But in any event.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. It's very thought-provoking, and you know, it challenged a lot of my sort of preconceived ideas about what originalism was limited to, and you know, what jurisprudential issues it has to address. And I wanted to just suggest some categories that might be useful to clarify certain issues in your paper. The first is the difference between a constitutional and a revolutionary change, and particularly when the revolution is conscious and open. The change you mentioned that in your list or your discussion of the various changes, you bring up the change between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. In Federalist 43 and in Washington's, I think his first inaugural address, they identify it as revolutionary. And the law in 43 is the transcendent law of nature and nature's God justified the breach of the existing. And I think that's not like some of the other changes you mentioned. Another set of categories related to that is the difference between a deliberate change, a conscious acquiescence, and a kind of forgetting. And these categories, I think, at least make sense when you're talking about statutes and constitutions. The Constitution on its face talks about ordering and establishing this Constitution. That the Constitution itself is a deliberate act. So non-deliberate, especially just unconscious abrogations or additions to the Constitution are of a different category and pose different types of challenges. And lastly, you go through, you suggest that there has not been or there is not today kind of a conscious rejection of, you say about the New Deal, for instance, on page 37. The New Dealers didn't claim to be replacing the original understanding with something better, but simply vindicating the actual Constitution. And I want to point to two different instances in American history where I think there was pretty explicit Constitution. The text itself is not something we're not going to be bound by. The first is the nullification of the 15th Amendment. I stumbled across an article recently where a defender of this, he was both a sort of a no offense to the University of Chicago, but a Chicago-educated segregationist jurist who just said, we don't care what these paper worshipers have to say. The only people who think like that are the remnants of the old abolitionists. The second is, with respect to the New Deal, this might sound a little more polemical, but at least outside of the courts themselves, the progressive jurists and the progressive thinkers said openly, we need to get rid of our Newtonian Constitution and replace it with Darwinian. It's just not working. And on the court, I'm going to point Blaisdell. There's a passage in Blaisdell which strikes me as pretty radical, and that is where they say, at least radical from my old-fashioned ideas, and that is what the Constitution meant to the vision of their time is not the same what it means to the vision of ours. And what's radical about that is apparently we're no longer, there's this breach between the noumena and the phenomena. It's no longer a Constitution we're expounding. It's our visions thereof, and each age has a coherent vision. So we can speak about our vision today, but it's not this sort of radical individualism where I don't even know whether you exist or not type thing. No, we all have a common vision, but we never actually get to the Constitution itself. And there's some other statements, like in Darby Lumber, they say something like, don't bother us with nomenclature. Don't talk to us about commerce and not commerce. That's just not something, it's another way of saying don't stop bothering us with the words. We've got important social changes that are necessary right now. So I just offer those. Stephen, so I think these are three great questions. Before I start, let me make just one clarification. So I do definitely think
that in some way the law sort of that we have today, and this most sort of connects to Mike Ramsey's question, is whatever we think about it now, in the sense that the law of France today is, to find that out, you have to go ask some French people. There's just no other way of doing it. That's sort of what positivism requires in certain ways. But at the same time, we can also make more contentful statements than that. So if you ask, what are the rules of baseball today? In some sense, it's just, well, whatever we all think the rules of baseball are. But if you open up the rule book of baseball, you don't see rule 1, do whatever we all think the rules of baseball are, and then, period, end of book. There's actually a whole lot of stuff in there that is the rules of baseball that we all happen to agree on today. And so my claims about the continuity thesis and about sort of continuity of the founding are all of this second type. They're the stuff that's in the baseball rule book that we all agree on, or at least, that would be the argument. And so in some sense, then, we can talk about the law changing from the sort of general positivist perspective, what would be necessary for the law to change there, as different from what would be necessary for the law to change according to the rule book. And that's a different set of questions. So this goes especially to David Altman's question about sort of deliberate changes or forgetting changes. Both of those kinds of changes are okay from a positivist perspective. If society just forgets that there are a bunch of statutes out there and sort of does so in such a way that sort of leaves them no longer to be the law, that's one thing. On the other hand, you might say, look, do we have doctrines of desuetude? And the answer is, except in West Virginia, no. So according to our doctrines, we don't care whether we've forgotten a statute that's out there, it's still the law. Supreme Court had a case where the codifiers of the US Code thought a law had been repealed in 1918, and were wrong about that fact if you go back and check the statutes at large. And so they said the law is still the law today, even though it hasn't been in the US Code since like the 50s. So according to what's in the rule book, to our doctrines of law, we don't have a rule that forgetting changes are okay. Similarly, with respect to constitutional and revolutionary change, I definitely think that's a useful distinction to draw that tracks the idea of sort of valid and invalid change in certain ways. I just want to make the emendation that not all invalid changes are big. They're revolutionary in some sense, but they might be sort of very minor bloodless coups in the sense that, the president declaring, like, now I can, overturn jaywalking laws is a really tiny change to American law overall, but it's clearly a discontinuity. It's clearly breaking us from the prior track, and for that reason, ought to raise a lot of eyebrows from this perspective. On Mike Ramsey's question, what counts as a valid change? Can long tradition change the law? So in some ways, so the part of the problem of this paper is it's stated at a very high level of abstraction. My claim is that the law that we have in any society has some substantive rules and some rules of change. And whatever is worked under those rules of change are valid changes. And whatever cannot be so worked is not valid. So the question, does long tradition change the law, is a legal question. And we'd have to look, using our positivist toolbox, to say, what is the rule? Now, it could be the rule in society today, and it might not have been the rule of society at the founding. And if that is the case, if there was a difference, we'd have to be able to explain that. And maybe we can't explain it, and that would mean continuity thesis is false. But if, so that's the general positivist take. Within the rule book take is, at least under my theory, it would be, what did the framers think? And moreover, has anything happened since that would make it valid law using valid tools? And defined in this recursive way back to the founding. So that's a historical question. My guess is that it mattered whether it was a tradition from the founding or whether it was a tradition from some later point. And this gets into sort of, doctrines of liquidation, and can something be reliquidated if it was liquidated one way one time and now, tradition shifts. But those would be the kinds of questions we would ask to get the answer. Can a long tradition of doing X change the law? Finally, on General Ohlendorf's point, I think this is an excellent question. I deal with it a tiny bit in my paper on backdrops. But I do think that there are different kinds of rules. So some rules are rules about turning texts into law. I think the implied repeal one is an example. You have an implied repeal in 19, you have a repeal in 1720 or 1920, does it revive something earlier? That would be a question about the law as it stood at the time of the enactment. Accomplice liability, I would say, is just a separate piece of law out there that runs on its own track. We have 18 U.S.C. 2, it establishes accomplice liability. If we repealed it, we have to look to the scope of the law to see whether what it does is, if we say no longer does committing the law as an accomplice make you liable as a principal, I think that might very well have application in future cases because it's really doing something else as opposed to shaping the legal content of each new enactment. Is the rule that we're talking about, is the statute we're talking about directed at the content of enactments, or is it directed at just other stuff in the law in the way that, you know, the federal rules of civil procedure can sort of change on their own track without affecting the meaning of substantive causes of action that are passed along the way? Something like the rule of lenity is a hard case, because you have to ask the question, is that a rule about the meaning of each new statute that's passed, or is that a rule about what judges do in cases of uncertainty? And that's the phrasing that we need to investigate to find out the answer.
Well, unfortunately, my apologies to those 5 people who remain on the queue, but we have to stop. You know, we've been promised drink and food, so thank you, Stephen.